Welcome to another episode of Coming to Your Senses, where we talk about navigating the labyrinth of the mind and emerging victorious. And if you're a regular listener to the podcast, then you'll know that many of my guests are people that I've met in random places. And today's guest, Ann Sheybani, falls absolutely into that category. We met at a conference, we think about 15 years ago, and I happened to sit behind her and her husband, and we got chatting. And we haven't stopped chatting really since then. Anne is somebody who helps people write and publish their own books. She is a writer and an author herself. She's an explorer. She's an ultra marathon runner, and she's a Jack Russell lover. There are.
That in. That's so vital to our conversation.
Of course it is. It's totally vital. And I am going to say, knowing Anne and I'm going to put a little bit of a pre-warning in here that there is a possibility that this conversation may go into salty language. We might go towards racy topics or things. I never know with Anne. It's one of the things that I love about her company. So thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, Anne.
I was so excited when you invited me because, first of all, I love Jules Wyman, and Jules all along these 15 or 16 years has taught me so much, not just by what she says, but how she behaves. So any opportunity to talk about our lives and this kind of topic, I'm all in. So thank you for sharing your platform with me, Jules.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. So I'm going to launch in with my first question, which is, can you tell us about one of those times in your life where you have come to your senses? So you've had that nudge, that kick up the butt, whatever it may have been, and where and what that led you to.
Like both of us know that I could probably list about 20 of these pivot moments. And when I looked at that question, the first thing that popped into my mind, which is what I'm going to go with, was being on a blind date. I had just come off of, a long divorce and, dating a whole assortment of inappropriate men. And I went on this Match.com date. And I was sitting across from this fellow. And no, it wasn't Walt, because yes, I met my husband on Match.com, but it wasn't my current husband. And the fellow asked me what I did for a living. And you would have thought that I was a streetwalker, because I found myself so embarrassed to tell him that I was a chemical salesperson, that I had a state, multi-state territory, and I sold industrial chemicals. And I kept hesitating and trying to cover myself. And he was confused, like, why would you not tell me that you sell chemicals? Why are you hesitating to tell me that? And I said, because I feel like I've outgrown it and I'm not meant to be in chemistry. So I'm embarrassed that I'm still in chemistry. And he didn't understand that either. And I didn't understand it. I just knew how embarrassed I was that I wasn't living what I think I would have called it authentically, although I wasn't really that schooled and any of that language at that time. And he said, well, if you don't want to be a chemist or a salesperson, what is it that you want to be? What did you always want to be? And I said, I think that I always wanted to be a writer. And here I am in chemistry, and it's just sort of, a vestige of my education and my past, and it served me well, but it feels like a bad fit for me right now. And so we were having this conversation for a while, and he said, well, why don't you go back to school and study writing? And at the time I was 37, 38, my former husband, the father of my children, had just died. I had 2 kids. I had this full-time job. I was working like crazy. I was living at home with my mother, back at home with my mom, with my kids. So everything in this was the wrong moment for me to make a change in my mind. And he said, well, you could go back to school. You could go to Harvard. And I said, I could go to Harvard, where Harvard is in the United States. I think Harvard is like Oxford. It's really hard to get in. You have to know people. You have to be top of the class. And he said, yeah, you could take a couple of classes at Harvard. And if you do really well, that's kind of your backdoor into, starting a master's program. And he explained how to do it. And I went home and I thought, Harvard was a 2.5 hour drive from where I was living. And it would have meant taking a class in the evening and driving 2.5 hours there, sitting in the class and coming home at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. And he sent me this catalog. He had a catalog sent from Harvard. And I'm looking at this catalog and I'm seeing all of these courses. I'm drooling. They sound so obvious. And everything in me this is crazy to do. I don't have time. I have too many responsibilities. And it was one of those moments that I realized that if I said yes, and if I did this crazy thing, then I don't know. So let's see what happens. And so I ended up registering for 2 courses. And within the first 2 weeks, I absolutely knew I was in the right place. And I absolutely knew that I was going to work my life schedule around this incident. And that saying yes, without knowing how I was going to do it, without knowing what was going to come of it, and without knowing even, what's up with that? Why do I got to be doing that right now? That completely changed the trajectory of my life. So when I'm looking at that moment, I think the key lesson for me is when there's this embarrassment or shame or jealousy or envy or some really negative emotion that crops up, everything in us wants to shy away from that or to disown those feelings or to, skirt those feelings. But the more I've been on this planet, the more I realize that those feelings are kind of a harbinger. And they're a harbinger of there's something not working in your life. There's something that you're not pursuing. There's something that there's a shift in you somewhere that you haven't acknowledged that you're going to have to deal with. That I don't think we should be so afraid of those emotions. I think we ought to be listening to them a bit better.
If you've listened to the first episode of Coming to Your Senses, you'll know that in the early 2000s, I experienced a breakdown. I tried different therapies, but it was coaching that truly helped me transform my life. Initially, when I discovered coaching, though, I couldn't afford it. And it was a kind soul who sponsored me not only to have coaching, but also to train and become a coach. And my promise to them was that I would pay it forward. And I've done that in many ways over the years, initially through social media and private Facebook group called Confidence Revolution, and also through Coming to Your Senses, the podcast. But it triggered for me a passion to really want to make and create a secure, supportive space for people to be able to come together and have conversations that transform their lives. So I created the Conscious Conversations community. It's a group where we meet on more than once a month, and we have a focused theme which is guided by the community and facilitated by me. There's hundreds of hours of learning and resources and materials to help you transform your life in a like-minded space. Because I get passionate about it and because this was my promise to pay it forward, I'm offering you the opportunity to trial it for £1 for the first month. If that appeals to you, then head to juleswyman.online/conscious conversations offer. juleswyman.online/conscious conversations offer to explore what's available for you through being part of a conscious community. I've never heard that story before, and I absolutely love it. When you started talking about going on a date, I genuinely thought you were going to talk about your meeting of Walt. So to hear that story, I think there's so much in it, because I think you're right that when there's an embarrassment or a shame, to me that's a siren. That's just it's not that you're doing something wrong, but it's out of alignment. That's the inauthentic side of it. Things is, I'm doing something because, and it might be because I need the money at that moment in time. But if you've reached that point where there's a possibility, even a chink of a doorway is slightly open, it's like, well, just give the door a bit of a nudge and see where it leads you to. And I really love what you've just said about saying yes, not knowing why, not really, other than a love of writing, but not having any attachment to the outcome of those courses. Not, it wasn't that you had to then go and do the master's program, or that you had to then set up your own writing business, you had to then write a book. It wasn't any of that stuff, but it was just about saying yes to that particular opportunity of those two classes. I absolutely love that, Anne.
Yeah, I think, this, I've started paying attention to this idea of having a consistent identity. And I grew up with this feeling like you were supposed to be this one thing, and you were supposed to be dependable, and you were supposed to follow a script, and you were supposed to be, whatever it is people expected you to be. And I really thought that deviating from the script was like the worst thing you could do. It would make you whimsical. I think maybe that's the idea. It's like, I didn't want to be a whimsical person, a Walter Mitty, so I clung to my identity. And the truth of the matter is, I had no clue who I was. I don't think I started coming into any sense of who Anne is until my 40s, and maybe even my 50s. It was this tapping around, trying to figure out what I wanted or who I really was, because I was always playing some sort of role, always trying to be something that somebody would approve of. Somebody would love me if I could act this way or be this way. And so switching an identity, switching a role, switching a career, switching, what my values were. Like, I was watching my back all the time. Like, oh, if I start valuing this more, what does that mean about me? Who is influencing that? Is it self-driven, or am I trying to impress somebody else? Like, what is based on what I want versus what I know somebody else wants in me or of me, and then somehow accommodating for that. So figuring out that that's what I wanted was really key. And I continue to try to figure out what is it that I want. I know what everybody else needs and what everybody else requires of me, but what is it that I want? I got to ask myself that almost every day.
I think that I don't know about you, and obviously with the work that you do, but what I notice with that one question is how women in particular not only struggle to ask that question of themselves, but even have an answer. A couple of months back, I had a new female client come in to the office, and I asked her that question, and she sat and thought for a moment. Her immediate answer was, I don't know. And then she sat and gave herself a bit more time. And in that silence, these tears started streaming down her face. And she just said, I just don't know. And it was so much in alignment with what you're saying of, we take on these scripts, we take on these identities and these conditions. I don't think it's exclusive to women. I think that we tend to buy into it a lot more. And I think that then it becomes quote unquote easier to hold on to the identity of mum, for example, and therefore then hide behind the children. Well, I have to do this because of the kids, or the kids want to do, or it's for the children. And actually, rather than doing what I hear you do, and I don't know how old your children were when you first took those classes, but to go, do you know what? I'm willing to drive this 5-hour round trip as well as do a class and do my full-time job and be navigating the family home with the children and my mum as well. That's a great deal to take on board in what could often be seen as a selfish way.
Oh, yeah. The word selfish. Yeah, that word selfish, like we don't like that word, but I'll tell you, learning to be selfish and letting people call me selfish and hearing people call me selfish and just allowing for that, um, and not trying to fix that. That's a challenge, because when you stop doing what you've done that makes everybody happy, like so my children, to answer that question and to just be totally female and weave in and out of, answering your question, because that's what we're going to do. So my kids were in high school. My daughter was off in boarding school for, she was like maybe 17, 16. My son was at home. He was in junior high. So he was, maybe 12, 13 when I started going. And my mother was covering it. So let's put a little gratitude there. Later in life, they looked at me and said that was selfish of me to do. It wasn't so much the time, it was that I was spending the money on furthering my education.
Interesting.
And they felt those resources could be better spent on something that they wanted, or better spent on funding their education or furthering their education in grad school and whatnot. It came, one of my kids, it came time, they wanted to go to grad school and they wanted me to cover grad school for them. And I had said no, that they were adults, and if they wanted to go to grad school, they could pay for that. And it came back that, you paid for your grad school, so you should pay for our grad school. And, drawing that line and saying, no, I did that for me. And now it's your job to do that for yourself, because more will come of it if you invest in yourself and you're not just, riding the education boat that we all want to ride for as long as possible, because it keeps us from entering the world when we're not ready to enter the world. That was a hard pill for me to swallow. And then I start looking at men. I'm married to somebody who changes identity pretty frequently, in that he changes. When I met him, he was a criminal defense attorney, and then he was, a speaker, and then he was a business coach, and then he went into ministry. And there weren't these big, shifts in him, like, I'm shedding my skin, this is so painful. It was like, on to the next thing. And I look at him, and I've heard other people and, adult kids say he's always been selfish that way. And I think men get to be selfish. He doesn't have the same reaction to the idea that he might be selfish. He's like, yeah, I'm an adult. I'm going to make these choices. I satisfy my responsibilities. So, what? But I look like, whenever somebody has called me selfish, or whenever I have used resources that other people might have access to, or that, it's a pool of some sort, then it's like, oh my God, I've used some resources to further my education to become who I'm meant to be. And, 20 years later, there's still sticking power in that. My kids will still reference that selfish move on my part. And I think, I hope they they are selfish in that way at some point in their life, that they haven't assumed or taken on the idea that once you're a parent or once you have an identity, that that's all you have. That's the one shot you got. And you better play that full out and keep to that path and not disappoint people who want some of those resources for their own desires. I think that's hard for women. It was really hard for me, and I'll still think about it. You know, that comment of being selfish.
Yeah, it's such an interesting one, and I think that very often we look for we want the 7-step process, or what's the immediate answer, or what's the right way, or the shortcut. And actually, I think every situation is different and difficult, and we also don't know. I think there's this thing from me, my perspective on it is, yeah, but we don't know. There's not a control group that we have access to, that we're aware of, where you didn't make that decision and you carried on selling chemicals and therefore had the funds for grad school, for example, and didn't ever go and do your writing exploration and be selfish. But we do have what the choices you've made now, and we don't know therefore then what the implications are, what that child, now adult, has learned that maybe wouldn't have learned or wouldn't have seen if you hadn't have made that choice. And I think that always intrigues me, because at the end of the day, the podcast episode that I've just edited, let me see if I wrote it down. Yeah, I did. My friend said, uh, change the future that you're walking into, because you can't change the past that you've walked out of.
Mm.
And I thought, I wrote it down, even the editing process, because I was like, that is so, so true. And yet we ruminate on. Now, we could dissect till the cows come home, depends on which rules or conditioning value system we look through as to whether that choice was selfish or not. But that's a personal interpretation rather than it being true. But what you did do is you looked at, okay, well, this is something I want to explore. And I think that the conditioning for women in particular is no, the children always come first, always, regardless.
Yeah. I'm going to jump off on a slightly different tangent. So the lesson I think my kids took away from that is that you shouldn't be selfish. All of your resources and efforts should go to your kids, because kids have to come first. And I think I would have wanted them to take away a very different lesson. The lesson that I thought I was giving them, whether it was conscious or unconscious, was that you're part of the equation too. And that if the person running the household isn't satisfying some need or desire or ambition, and is just home, being the grunt labor, so to speak, then nobody's going to be happy. That everybody is part of the equation. The kids aren't just the be all to end all. And yet I recognize that we can't control what lesson our kids or anybody else around us, we're just talking kids right now, what lesson they take away from anything we say or do. We can't control that. Because when I look back at my household growing up, I think that my mother wanted very much to teach me that with a college education, you'll never have to depend on a man. You get yourself a degree in chemistry or in the sciences or in math, and you will never have to suffer a marriage where you are trapped. And that was a message she was speaking to me, and would, talk about her sacrifice that she's making by staying in a bad marriage so I wouldn't have that burden of not being able to support myself. But the message I actually took away from that is, it's so bad out there that without a man, you're going to die out on the tundra. And even though she was like, yeah, you've got an education, you're free, it was like, why are you staying with somebody who's just not a good person and creates such havoc in the family? That, like, totally different lesson. And then I operated on that lesson and how I interpreted it my entire life, rather than seeing my chemistry degree as the freedom to avoid her fate. So, like, we can't control what people make of what we do or how they interpret it. They're going to interpret it any kind of way that they choose. So you might as well live your life. You might as well try to be overt about your messaging. But even if you're overt about your messaging, it's still going to be, confused or contorted,
misinterpreted
entirely.
Yeah, as you're talking, I don't know that we're talking about in the sense of how children interpret a parental quote unquote message, and where whichever dynamic you're looking at it. But as you're talking, then I'm like, well, hang on a second. This is what I experienced, and I'm pretty sure you'll have experienced something similar. Where at the end of doing a speaking engagement, I've had so many times where people have come up to me and gone, oh, when you said blah, 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 that really hit home for me. And internally, I'm going, I know I never said that. I never, ever uttered those words. And I'm assuming it's the same. Well, I know it's the same for when I write things for my newsletter, or as an author yourself, and I'm sure with many of the people that you work with and help them write their books, is that we cannot guarantee how that message is going to be interpreted. Whatever, no matter how over, as you said, that we're going, this is what I mean by this, someone can still misinterpret it and go, yeah, but underneath it, what you were trying to say is, it's like, no, it was just this, actually. It's very basic.
It's such a mirror. Writing in particular, and, like, books are such a mirror to the person who is reading it. My mother had this book, and I just remember this when I was living with her. She had this book. It was written by Shirley MacLaine, who was, an American actress. And Shirley MacLaine had gone off, and you might be familiar with some of her stuff. She'd gone off into channeling and, like, searching for her, spiritual life. And my mother had gotten a hold of her book because she remembers Shirley MacLaine from Hollywood. And Shirley MacLaine had said something like, in her 50s, when she started pursuing this spiritual path, she no longer had to fend off men or their advances, because she was looking at men very differently. She was operating in the world very differently. And I had read that, and I was thinking to myself, wow, your pursuit of other things in the world changes how people respond to you, because when you change, others around you change. So I was taking home that message that everything starts from within. And my mother had come down to the dinner table and she said, Shirley MacLaine was right. The older you get, the more you no longer attract men. Men all want women. Men all want women. And I'm thinking, like, lady, we just read the same damn thing.
Yeah.
And it was a mirror for what she was experiencing as a 55-year-old divorced woman who wanted, to find another partner, and was, having trouble and feeling not particularly attractive. And I was on that spiritual quest, or like, what about me needs to change in order to change what's going on around me? Because I think there's something inside that's drawing stuff to me that I don't want drawn to me. And so there's innocent Shirley MacLaine or her ghostwriter or whoever putting these words down on a page, and you've got people's different interpretations all the time. And I have this conversation with authors all the time who want to get it just so on the page, and they'll sweat, how they're saying it, and who they might insult and how they should shape this. And I'll say, dude or girl, you gotta like drop that, because you put it down on the page as best you can. You make sure that you're covering all of your thoughts, that you're getting all of your thoughts regarding this topic down there. But then you stand back, because you are going to be so misinterpreted by so many people. And then on the good side, you're going to be so misinterpreted for the good that you brought people by your words that you've never actually sat down and probably never intended to connote. So there's only so much control you have of other people and what they make of you, or what they make of your words, or what they make of your message. And the rest is a crapshoot, for good or for bad.
I love that. I love that. And it's the same thing as well, I reread The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho when I was traveling in Nepal earlier this year. I wanted to take a small book with me, and I know it's one that I actually haven't. I used to read it every year, and I haven't read it for quite a long time. And I was like, I really want to read this again. And again, because I've changed so much since I read it last time, that reading it this time, I'm interpreting the story in a very, very different way to how I did the last time I read it, but certainly from the first time I read it. So it's interesting when we have those shifts. And what I'm curious about is then following on from what you were saying about that, the revelation of actually I could put myself first. I could. How did you walk away from full-time employment into the pursuit of? And I've watched you over the 15 years. I've just watched you really settle into who you are and how you are in that moment, which gives you a freedom, and you have a wonderful curiosity. You're one of these people who ask me questions that sort of like hit me from the side, and I'm like, geez, I didn't see that coming. And I don't mean in a coachy way, but in a real deep curiosity about human people and how they function. So how did you make that shift, and then sort of what was the fallout for you following that?
Yeah, I love that question. I think that if there's a one takeaway that you can misinterpret, feel free to misinterpret this takeaway all, is that it's such not a straight line. This is such a non-linear path that it's ridiculous. It's such a non-linear path. Like when you and I met, Jules, I had just gotten into the idea that I didn't have to be a salary girl. Like, ooh, you don't have to, punch a time clock, and you don't have to wait for your paycheck. And I like getting a paycheck, regular paycheck. I like somebody telling me what to do and doing it. Don't get me wrong. I think there's a lot to be said for being a salary person. I'm not one of those people who say, chuck the salary, chuck the cubicle and go get yourself an entrepreneurial position, because it takes a very particular type of personality. And I didn't have that personality. So I had to grow into that with a lot of bumps and starts. But when I got the idea from the conference that we were at, that you could create a business out of things that you're interested in, at the time when we met, I was tapping around, well, maybe I could teach Vietnamese. Like, there's about 2 people on the planet in the United States who have this burning desire to learn Vietnamese by basically have basic conversation and not much more than that. And, at the time I was also teaching a writing workshop with a couple of partners, but I didn't equate the writing workshop to anything but my writing and my pleasure and, making, some pin money, as we call it, by conducting these 6-week classes. And I had partners, but I didn't see that as something that I could scale or grow. That was for fun. That was my fun. So then I was like, oh, I'll teach people how to draw healthy boundaries. Well, because, you teach people what you need to know at the time. So I was the person with the sketchiest boundaries on the planet. But I'm like, hey, well, I'm learning how to draw boundaries. I'm going to teach other people how to draw boundaries. And so, it started with putting up a website about how to draw boundaries and then realizing that I was attracting people who had no boundaries either. And we were all just the blind mess. And, it was like a year and a half of recognizing, oh, okay, I need to speak and I need to be out there and start a newsletter and I need to be doing stuff. So like those little pieces parts had clicked into place on how you go about creating a business. And it was, just like a U-turn, a wrong turn, come around. And maybe it was you who said, well, Ann, you're like a writer. Why don't you teach people how to write? And I'm like, I guess I could do that. And so it went from having this writing workshop and looking at it slightly differently, going, oh, yeah, I could market this. And then this could grow into something else. And I think I started really taking off on the idea that I could make more than $360 every 6 weeks from a student when my husband Walt started working for Tony Robbins as a coach. And we sat around a table and a bunch of the coaches learned that I was a writer, that I had a writing workshop. And they said, could you teach our people, our clients, how to write a book? Because to a one, all of them had at least 3 clients that had the bucket list item of, I've always wanted to write a book. So could you teach them how to write a book? And I'm like, oh, sure, I can teach people how to write a book. And suddenly I put this class together, a 6-week class, and they sent me all these people. And I taught a class on how to write a book. I think I called it Build a Book Boot Camp. And they kept feeding me clients every few months, and I would run this class. And bit by bit, somebody in the class would say, could you work with me one-on-one? And so there were all of these yeses. Can you teach people how to write a book? Yeah, I'll figure it out. I can teach you how to write, and then let me read a little bit and how to write a book, put it together. I know I'm working on writing a book. I can tell you all the things not to do. These are the things that are going to work for you. I've tried these. Bad, don't go down this path. And so it's yes, I can, without knowing how I'm actually going to do it or how it's going to pan out or whether or not it's going to be successful. No idea. And I want to emphasize something. I think this is really important. I had a financial safety net underneath me, right? So if I was making $360 every 6 weeks, or I was making $3,600 every 6 weeks, it didn't make no never mind, because I had that financial support system under me. So I could say yes without not knowing how, and I could write it out without feeling the stress of, how the hell am I going to make this work? I got to make this work. I never had that. I got to make this work or the kids ain't eating.
Yeah.
Right? Like that. I think that's really key for people, because for those who are trying to make it work and they're driving Uber or they're waiting tables, trying to make it work, more power on you. It may be a slower trajectory. You might have to be more aware of your yeses or nos at any given time. This isn't like this works for everybody. This is a fully supported system and how it worked for me. But yes became somebody else saying, can you do this for me? And me having no clue. Or just enough of an inkling, yeah, I can figure it out. Yeah, I can figure it out. Yeah, I can figure it out. Because that, yeah, I can figure it out was not something I was saying at 30, was not something I was saying at 20. It was, I don't know how to do it, so I hope somebody else is going to take care of it for me. Just look for someone who.
Although I will interject there and just call you out on, because as you were saying that, I'm like, do you know what? I can see this as a pattern in Anne's life of saying, yeah, I can work it out, because you're going to live in another country. I can't remember how old you were with your first husband. And that was a yeah, I can work it out, because you didn't know the language, you didn't know the culture, you didn't know any of that. So I appreciate it wasn't the glamorous, successful, joyous, easy life. But nonetheless, you still had that seed of, yeah, I can work it out.
Yeah, I
In
had a
my
yeah,
view.
yeah, I had a guy who could work it out. Yeah, I
Right.
had
So
a
you had a support you could lean on.
yeah, I had a
Okay.
guy. Right. Again, coming back to my mother's, like if you have a guy, if you've got a man, you hold on to that. So moving to Iran, I was 26. Moving to Iran was, yeah, that sounds great, right? An adventure, yeah, I could do that, yeah. But it was, I was going there with somebody who was part of the culture, who was going to navigate the culture, who was going to navigate making money, who was going to provide a life for me. And I went there very naive, love is going to conquer all. And yeah, I'm going to be great. I'll learn languages. I knew I could learn languages. That was a skill set early on that I had. So I've always had this pattern of, yeah, I can figure it out. But I've also known or felt safety nets beneath me.
Okay.
And, I talk to a lot of people who don't feel like they have a safety net and it's all on them. And they're very cautious about, yeah, I'll figure it out. They're not sure they can figure it out in a timely fashion and still satisfy their responsibilities. So, this is your area of expertise, Jules. Like, how do you help people find that they do in fact have some sort of safety net, be it a person or themselves or whatever it is, in order to make those leaps? Because I can't think of a time where I didn't build a safety net for myself in the form of a person or a pool of money that I, built over time. I don't know how to do it without that. Do you?
Um. Yes. Yes, I do. And I think that I think I took on unconsciously at a very young age the um, perception that I had to work it out myself, because none of the big people around me were going to do it. So I had to work it out. So the analogy that I would always use is that I would jump into the pool and then go, oh shit, I need to learn to swim. Okay. And then, it wouldn't be elegant or graceful or effective, other than keeping me afloat. But that in a lot of senses, is the haphazard way that I've done it. But I think over time now I've learned a much more refined way, and so much of it is about having trust within myself, which is what I've seen you master and continually evolve with over time, is that trust within you. But also for me, and again, I would say there's elements of it in what I've seen of your development over the 15 years, is a faith in life. Now, I think that even though you had originally lent on a man and then had that financial safety net, nonetheless, I think there's an element of perceiving that as wrong, and it's like, no, that was just the way at the time, that because that's what you needed and knew and thought was the right thing. And then as you've grown, it's like, actually, I can say yes and not no, and not be 100% sure what comes next, and that's okay too. And I think that's what struck me when you were talking earlier, and you said about life's not a straight line. What struck me was a gravestone, and how on the gravestone it will have the start date and the end date, but it's like that small dash in between. And often what's said is that's life is in that little dash. And I just thought, if I have no intention really of having a gravestone, but I've just thought what I need to do is 1972 and then whatever the year is that I end. And instead of it being a dash, there's just this squiggle that goes all over the place to that end date. Because what I heard you describing, even though you were talking about safety nets, is a playfulness of, I really want to do this. This goes back to my perception of you, of that you have a playful curiosity, which I think you certainly invite when we have a conversation. I've seen you invite that in colleagues as well. And my assumption is that you do that in regardless of whatever the business is that you're doing, is that you invite you hear the problem and it's like, okay, so this could be a solution, or that could be a solution, or what else do you think could be a solution? And there isn't the straight line. There is, you have this, and maybe that's because of your upbringing, maybe that's a characteristic you brought into this lifetime, maybe it's a learned skill, I don't know. But that to me certainly seems to be something that I interpret from your behaviors.
I love how I have mirrored you. That could be a mirror for you, Jules Wyman. I think that I really love knowing how people think. I love knowing how other people see the world and how they perceive themselves and what they think. And part of that curiosity is not understanding myself and being absolutely flabbergasted, like, what the hell was I thinking? Or why on earth would any sane person do what I just did? And, I've come to realize that it's real, what people are doing is so interesting. Like, they've done this, they do that. Jules just went off to Nepal, and by the way, I want to hear all about the circuit and all about your experience in Nepal. But more interesting than what people do is why they do it. And I think I so want to know, why did I do that? What makes me tick? What was driving me? What was behind that? Because the craziest parts of my life, and I was like a hot mess in my teens and my 20s and probably into my early 30s. I was a hot mess. I was not the girl you would bring home to mother. And like, you'd have to explain why you were friends with somebody like that who just does a crazy ass stuff. But it's like, what's driving that? What is it? What's the need that I was trying to feed with that? And so, because I wanted to understand myself, because I puzzled the hell out of everyone around me, but I puzzled myself, I would start like, well, what do you think? Like, why are you doing that? What's your thought on that? When you look at this, what do you see? Because I know I'm this interpretation chamber, and I'm looking at something and I see something. And then when I say what I'm seeing, people are like, oh my God, what? Like, how on earth are you seeing that? It's like, oh, I don't know. That's how I'm interpreting. That's how I'm seeing it. And then I realized, oh, you mean you don't think like that? And so when people are revealing how they think and how they see, then it's almost like radar blips, like a bat looking for its path, and blip, blip is that, don't go there, that blip, blip. Like, I'm finding myself almost as a radar blipping off of other people. And then it's a great way. Do I think like that? No, I don't have that opinion. And maybe I don't have that same opinion because I've had these experiences. Or, wow, you did that? That's crazy. And you did that because of this and this and this, and following the train backwards. And that kind of understanding that we're all doing stuff to meet our needs, and we're doing it in healthy ways and unhealthy ways. And we're interpreting the events around us in some crazy ass ways that others around us have no idea of the circus show going on inside you. And I find that, get me a bucket of popcorn, because I and find out what you're thinking. I think there's nothing more fascinating than that. So like working with people on their books, and people have amazing stories and they want to tell their stories, and they'll start telling their stories, and I like 3 stories in and I'm like, that's actually really interesting. You think this story is interesting? Ooh, let's pull this back 4 stories back, because that's the start of everything. That's your why. That's your driving force. That's the power behind everything that you do. And like the fact that people let me ask them the most intimate questions, and that they'll share it with me and we'll talk about it and interpret it. That to me is like sheer joy. I get to be in F-16 fighter pilot head who's got a million pieces of data coming at them, a million miles an hour, and their ability to make choices one after the other, all automated. Like, how do you keep your head together? I blow apart if I have too many calls in a day.
Well, that actually leads me on to, and as you were talking before I ask the final 2 questions, actually, the image that came to my mind was when I visited you in Connecticut, and we went to your cafe that you used to go to, and there was a lot of your writer friends in there. And I remember us being sat having a coffee, and you just looking at other people and us coming up with different stories and possibilities of what was going on, and but it not being in a judgmental way, but just in a pure curiosity. Let's just chuck it all up as potentials and just see what we want to play around with. And it's such a freeing way of being that so many of us don't, because we get caught up, if we go back to the beginning, of the scripts and the conditioning and the roles and the identities, that we end up restricting rather than actually being in this possible mindset and this let's just be playful with it and see where it leads us. So I'm going to ask I usually ask the last question, then I end up asking a second question, and I'm going to ask the second question first before I ask the last question. Is there anything that we haven't spoken about that you would really love to speak about?
I don't know. Like, we could talk for hours, Jules. We could talk for hours and hours and hours. I don't know. There's just like life, right? How do you express everything that you think about life and that you've learned about life? I love the idea. I think maybe it's agency, of knowing that you are capable, or coming to the realization that you can do so much on your own steam. Like, because I felt so dependent on other people. The moment that I learned that most of the time I could do better at doing something on my own, rather than, carrying the weight of expectations, from other people. If you're locked onto somebody as your source, as your safety net, that's not free. There are expectations placed on you that is kind of a payback for having that safety net, in my mind. Again, circus, right? That's how I interpret that. But I think the moment I recognized that I could actually do amazing things on my own steam was probably running a marathon and training for that. That was the moment I recognized I could do hard things and work towards it, that there was a process involved, that it wasn't a flick of a switch or it wasn't instant pudding, but that you work towards something and you get a result. And the longer you stay steady in a process that gives you no guarantees, there's a point where you recognize it's grown you and you've stuck through it, and that gives you an agency. Like, self-agency to me is the key to living life on your terms, having it, not giving it away, not negotiating it away. So yeah, I'm a big fan of agency.
I love that. I love that. And I love the reminder that it's through doing the hard stuff that you realize what you're capable of, and it's sticking with it even when it's got hard. And it's, I want to run a marathon. Well, if you've never run before, then getting up and running it the next day is probably not on the cards. So look at the process that's involved.
Yeah.
And I love that. So then my final question, because as you're absolutely right, we could talk for at least 4 or 5 hours. What advice or guidance would you give somebody to help them navigate the chaos of life? That it might be around them helping maintain clarity, it might be those foundations, or continuing and sticking with that process. What's worked for you that are your go-tos, or even what hasn't worked?
I just think, I really do like coming back to the idea of process, because I grew up and I didn't understand the idea of process, and I've heard this from several people before, like they'll have parents or chaos in a household, and one minute everything's falling apart and the next minute everyone's sitting around the breakfast table acting like it never happened. So there's no obvious fixing. It's on and off switches. And I think understanding that everything that you want or everything that you envision that, you see other people having and, you're jealous or envious of it. The stuff you don't see is the process that took to get there, and the sticking with it, and the beginning something when you're completely unsure as to how it's going to pan out, or if it's going to turn out, or if it's going to be worth the investment of time, money, energy, and just starting anyway. Because even if it doesn't pan out the way you've envisioned it, you change, you alter, something comes of it in the process that you may or may not even be bargaining for. And so, you're aiming for you're aiming for Everest Base Camp and you're suddenly in Tibet, right? But your journey up to Tibet is like, wow, I have changed so much. This is amazing. I had this amazing experience without, getting to the Everest Base Camp. The idea that it's not going to be a switch, that it's this process filled with doubt and wrong turns and, misinterpretation on your part and other people's parts and obstacles. It's like coming over those obstacles is probably the name of the game. I mean, that's why you're in it, not to get where you're going, but to figure out that you can get over the obstacles and make shit happen that you didn't think you were capable of making happen, and sticking to it and being in it for the long run and the long haul rather than giving up because it doesn't lay down immediately the way you thought it should. So, huge fan of process.
I love that. I love that. I really, really do. And I think it is something that, people I want to say that it was Tony Robbins that said this, but I could be wrong, that people are rewarded in public for the work they do in private. And I think it's so, so very true. And having worked backstage in theatre and television for 10 years and seen everything from people throwing up at the side of the stage because they're so nervous, or arguments kicking off in the interval, and a performer's really pissed off and they don't want to go back on stage and having to convince them to go back on, and all the work that goes in behind the scenes. It doesn't matter. It doesn't have to be in that level of performance. It could be just somebody turning up for work that day. You don't know what's gone on in their home life for them to be where they are and how they're there, and the fact that they've got clothes on, could be a big thing. So I think that it's so important to recognize that we never know what's going on for somebody. But also, for what I hear you say, and I'm going to certainly take away from this conversation, is recognizing that it's a process, and it's just about what's the next bit. And by saying yes to things, sometimes we don't know the end outcome, but there's a process in that journey to, dare I use the J word, of getting to that, to see who we become along the way. And I think that that's really key. So I will your details so that people can reach out to you in the show notes. And I didn't know where this conversation was going to go. I didn't know where your starting point was going to be. And it's an absolute pleasure. And I have to say that from the moment I met you, I knew there was a connection. I loved your feistiness, and you certainly gave me what for in a really good way, and called me out on things like my Britishness and stuff, which is really cool. But what's been so beautiful to witness over the last 15 years really is your growth. And it has been something of watching you coming into your own. And one of the reasons I want to flag that up is to anybody who's listening, who's in their 20s or their 30s, and they think that they're a complete shit show and that they don't know really what they want to do and everything is all going all haywire, is to recognize that, you know, I'm in my 50s, Anne's in her 60s. We're only just feeling like we're understanding life a little bit. It's okay. It's absolutely okay. And I think that you are an exemplar of that process yourself. So thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. And I look forward to catching up with you very soon, as well as you very soon.
Thank you, Jules.